computer. Okay. Well, good afternoon from the United States and good evening to Luxembourg, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to have you. First of all, Happy New Year. We wish the best for you and your family for 2022. This is our first event of the year, and we're really honored to work with, of course, AmCham, collaborating with them and co-hosting it. We want to welcome some distinguished guests here. Mr. Steinmetz, Paul Steinmetz from Consul General in New York, Luxembourg, and the Executive Director of LTAO, Luxembourg Trade and Investment Office in New York City. We also have some people from the Embassy of Luxembourg in Washington, D.C. Clemence, I think, is on here. We have many honorary consuls of North America and many others. So we welcome you, and we welcome everyone for making the time to listen to this unique event, opportunities and challenges of ESG regulatory aspects. We want to thank VISTRA, Amel, who we worked very hard, many months, and Janet, to put this event together, and of course, AmCham, and our speakers, Jervis and Tomas. I would like to introduce to you today, which we're going to be Mr. Steinmetz. He's going to do introductory remarks, but before that, let's go over some housekeepings. Please mute your microphone. We will record this event, okay, and we will share it on social media, okay? We will have questions and answers, and please use the chat for that. Or at the end, if you have a question, I think our speakers will be delighted to answer them, okay? Let me introduce now Mr. Steinmetz, okay? Paul, to you.
Thank you, Tony. Very happy to be here today, a sunny day in New York, and glad to support this event with LACC, AmCham, and VISTRA. Our presentation today is by LACC member VISTRA on ESG's regulatory aspects, as you said. VISTRA is a global corporate service provider and fund administrator with nearly 5,000 professionals in 45 jurisdictions and about 400 billion US dollars of assets under administration. But looking at ESG from New York, I'm struck by the difference in atmospherics between both sides of the Atlantic. While there's a consensus in Europe, there are heated discussions in the US. I just finished reading an article this morning in the Wall Street Journal, Why the Sustainable Craze is Flawed, which itself followed one by the same author a few days ago on, I quote, ESG investing can either be good or do well, but not both. So there is a political, economic, social discussion, even cultural in the US. But there is clearly also a bottom-up effort. We've recently seen Larry Fink's letter, Larry Fink from BlackRock, of course, Larry Fink's letter to the CEOs they've invested in. And also from the top, we are seeing some statements like the one by the Federal Reserve on setting up a climate stress test for banks, or Mr. Gensler from the SEC about requiring more information from asset managers about the criteria they use when mentioning the sustainability of their investment products. So this European approach, which is more top-down, and which is less favored in the US, may inform the US one. But of course, in the US, you also have this strong bottom-up approach, which makes the strengths of the US economy and the financial markets. But generally, we Europeans tend to think that we're a little bit ahead on ESG, looking at the debate in the US. So I'm curious to see whether this is accurate. So let's listen to the speakers from VISTRA. Our first speaker is Jervis, Country Managing Director, Luxembourg, who has more than 35 years of experience in the banking and finance industry. Over to you, Jervis. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Paul. Is there an echo?
No.
Okay.
No
echo.
Jervis, I think you'll want to mute the mic on your laptop and just use the mic that is on your telephone.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you so much.
Super. Okay, well, thanks very much, Paul. That was very good. And firstly, although I'm sitting in Luxembourg in a rather dank and dreary evening, VISTRA itself, if I just give you a little bit of introduction on the slide that we have in purple, is a global organization. So we're in 46 countries around the world, and we're one of what they call the big three corporate and fund services providers. So consequently, we don't just have a regional focus and think just about the EU, for example, if you're based in Luxembourg, but we also understand the different approaches to things like tax, climate, employment legislation all over the world, and that's how we help our clients. I'm the country MD for Luxembourg, as Paul said, where we have a client base that's truly international. There's not very many of our based in Luxembourg or headquartered in and we also have a very vibrant one-stop shop service for organizations wishing to set up alternative investment funds in Europe. So that's really why I think we wanted to come and try and explain some of the strange regulations that have been brought in, because as Paul highlighted, the approach to ESG, environment, social and governance, has been very different on the two sides of the Atlantic. And you know, it's sort of quite incredible to think that the term ESG was only first used about 17 years ago. Yes, if we come to the VISTRA slide, I think it's the next one. When the United Nations had a report called Who Cares, which was initiated by friend Kofi Annan. And that report made the case that embedding ESG into capital markets made good business sense, but it also led to more sustainable markets and better outcomes for society. So Kofi Annan would have totally disagreed with the author of the paper that Paul was talking about you can either do good or make money. You can actually do both. And I think the interest that Larry Fink and others have is not purely about do-gooding when they're asking organizations to adopt things like the sustainable accounting standards. It is also because they recognize that there is an appetite, particularly in the younger generation, to try to make money and do good at the same time. So that's a very interesting development. We haven't got time to talk too much about that. We're really going to focus on the regulations. So as Paul said, although last year the SEC, for instance, did announce an all-agency approach to tackling climate change and other ESG risks and opportunities, the SEC is also undertaking a review of mandated climate-related and other disclosures relating to ESG in public company filings to try and avoid what they call greenwashing. The pressure has largely come from the investors themselves. So as you said, BlackRock and others pushing for the adoption of these standards, TCFD, the WEF's disclosure frameworks, and all of these, which are privately led initiatives rather than government-led or regulatory-led. But that's different in Europe. I don't know whether it's cultural, but in Europe, the regulators and the governments have really taken a step forward. So when you said Europe is ahead, I think we're probably 3 years ahead in terms of regulations, But of course, the appetite for doing the right thing is very similar on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed worldwide. So if we look at the next slide, Janet, what has the EU been doing? So it's really a four-pronged approach, and we won't talk about three of them too much today, except to refer to them. But climate and energy and the environment, first two pillars, which obviously we've had, COP26 and so on recently, have had a lot of visibility. The EU is very much a part of all of that. Very interestingly for us in the financial services, investment and growth is another important sustainable policy. But I think we're going to focus, because that's probably worth a whole webinar in its own right. We're going to focus today on sustainable finance and the regulations relating to that. It's become a bit of a minefield, so we thought this was a timely approach to try and simplify things and explain the key elements of that. And so perhaps I could bring in VISTRA's sort of resident spokesperson on ESG here in Luxembourg, which is Tomas Tobolka. Tomas joined VISTRA only a couple of years ago after 16 years in the investment industry in various different capacities. So he's worked for asset management companies most of the time, and has only recently come across to be one of the conducting officers of our alternative investments fund management company, whose role it is to police effectively the investment manager and making sure that they are following the sectors. So complying with ESG is very much part of Tomas's job as well as his passion. And I'm sure his suggestions as to how to avoid tripping up on some of these issues in practical way will be very valuable to everybody. So perhaps, Tomas, I could start by asking you, what exactly is the Sustainable Finance Action Plan that we've heard so much about?
Thank you, Jervis, for such a kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you, all of you, today. Well, the past few years have witnessed an unprecedented rally from investors towards ESG investments and funds. And this is representing a profound shift in investors' expectations. Investors no longer focus on the financial performance only, and they're eager to ensure that the financial returns are not obtained at any cost. And then the investing companies have a good ESG practices. Between 2016 and 2018, European Union's high-level expert group produced a roadmap for the EU to pursue two goals. First one being to integrate sustainability considerations into financial system. And the second one was to steer the flow of capital towards sustainable investments. And to implement this roadmap, the European Commission launched its flagship Sustainable Finance Action Plan with the SFDR and taxonomy as its core pillars. And we go in more detail later in the webinar in terms of SFDR and taxonomy. The Sustainable Finance Action Plan has main three objectives. First one is to reorient private investments towards financing sustainable activities, starting with defining environmental sustainable activities. And this is done through taxonomy regulation. And taxonomy regulation is defining eco-labels for financial products and climate change benchmarks. And essentially, the European taxonomy is a dictionary for describing what constitutes environmental sustainable activities. The second pillar or objective is to foster more long-termism and transparency on sustainability within the investment advice process. And this is basically done to be done for Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or so-called SFDRs. The SFDR introduces new sustainability-related disclosure obligations for financial market participants, which as an AIFM we are part of, and we basically produce or basically host our clients as a third-party AIFM and enable them to actually market their products in the EU. And then third one is to ensure that sustainability risks are adequately captured, assessed, and considered throughout the investment process. Well, in this context, successful market players are those that are able to adopt their strategy, processes, product offering, and corporate messaging to fully reflect that ESG is no longer a niche strategy, but a mainstream component of investment advice and investment products. And the implementation of EU regulations stemming from the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan will further accelerate the transition towards sustainable investing, as even the most ESG agnostic investors will have no choice but to consider ESG risks in their investment process.
So, okay, so if I get that right, that's the sort of background to some of the key legislation that the EU members are bringing in. But how do you think ESG is doing as a theme, at least here in Luxembourg funds? Is this a sort of must conform situation, or will people continue to produce and people continue to buy less sustainable products just because of their performance?
I mean, Luxembourg is famous for being the fund hub in Europe, and definitely Luxembourg continues to be the leading hub for establishment of investment funds in Europe. I mean, despite the ongoing pandemic, Luxembourg has seen a continued growth of the assets under management, increasing to overwhelming amount of nearly 5.8 trillion, reported in November 2021, which was also noted on the CSSF website, which is the regulator in Luxembourg. And this shows a continuous and stable growth and development in the market. One of the current trends driving growth and development in the Luxembourg fund industry is sustainable finance. In February 2021, so last year, the credit rating agency Moody's acknowledged this trend by certifying Luxembourg good ESG performance with an AAA rating, and this was done for the first time ever. And the positive ESG grade score given to Luxembourg reflects continued efforts in this area by the government and market players, also low exposure to environmental social risks, and top performing governance and a very high capacity to respond to market disruptions. Also, ALFI reported that Luxembourg was highlighted as the leading domicile of its sustainable funds, accounting for around 371 billion by end of 2020, which captures roughly 45% of total net flows made across all European domiciles in 2020. I believe the main drivers towards the ESG liquidity flows to direction are, let's say, in alphabetical order: investor demand based on a changing mindset towards sustainability in general, then political and regulatory pressure, and reputational considerations. In this context, a global shift towards sustainable finance, driven not least by an ambitious regulatory agenda in the EU, Luxembourg has taken and continues to take the leading position in the development of new products and services. Well, it can be argued that we are now at the start of a new era of complete reshaping of finance and redirection of private capital towards greener and more sustainable environmental objectives and investments. And therefore, I believe this trend is expected to continue accelerating in the near future. But as usual, however, this is not going to go without some challenges.
So the combination of this demand for ESG product and the EU's regulatory drive points to a very busy near-term future for you and for all of us, frankly. What do you think the key milestones during the next year or so will be?
Definitely going to be busy this year, not only on the regulatory front, but business at all. But I mean, 2022 will likely be a defining moment in the European ESG regulatory calendar. I mean, this definitely represents a steep learning curve for all of us. Starting from 1st of January, so nearly a month ago, basically the EU Taxonomy for climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation came into force. And also during the rest of the year, the implementation of amendments of MiFID II UCITS, AIFM ID, IDD, and Solvency II, as well as the application of regulatory technical standards, which will, I'm pretty sure, go into more detail in a few minutes, will follow. And this string of regulatory changes will substantially impact the business conduct and product design, but also the data gathering. I mean, just looking at the slide, I will start with the rectangles disclosure regulations, basically, which are kind of in blue, with the blue headings, and they refer to SFDR. Under SFDR, financial market participants are required to disclose qualitative and quantitative information on their approach to ESG, including the management of sustainability risks that may impact on the value of their investments, and principal adverse impacts, i.e. the potential negative impacts that their investments have on the environment and society. Although the intentions behind these regulations are widely supported, the approach taken to implement them has been less well received, and incomplete and complex reporting requirements, phased execution, and moving deadlines have caused confusion and resulted in uncertainty, and in some cases, inactivity across the industry. I mean, for example, in November 2021, so a few months ago, the European Commission announced that due to the technicality and extent of updates made to the latest version of the draft RTS, the implication of such single delegated act encompassing this RTS will be further postponed by a period of 6 months, resulting to 1st of January 2023. At the same time, however, the European Commission confirmed that the financial market participants, which already consider principal adverse impacts on sustainability matters, or contemplating doing so in the future, will have to proceed the relevant required disclosures in the manner proposed by the concerned delegated act, capturing this RDS on the website by end of June next year. With the first reporting period from 1st of January 22 to 31st of December 2022. And as a result, financial market participants, which is also us as a third party host, AIFM and other clients, which consider these principal adverse impacts, are urged to actually start collecting the relevant data as of the beginning of January 22. I mean, the RTS are a really important addition to the regulation, as they specify the way certain SFDR disclosures should be presented, aiming to increase the quality and comparability for an investor. And most importantly, the RTS provide templates for Article 8 and 9 product level disclosures, which I will explain a bit later, and the statement of consideration for practical adverse impacts at entity level.
What are the challenges of the taxonomy scheme? You mentioned the challenges earlier on. What are the challenges?
Before I go to challenges, just let me, if I may, just touch base on those rectangles, starting with the green headings, because basically taxonomy is a primarily classification system for economic activities, and like any classification system, it has definitions and rules. And the EU taxonomy's definition and rules determine which economic activities are environmentally sustainable. And this is following on EU Green Deal. Basically, taxonomy aims to create security for investors, protect stakeholders from greenwashing, plan the clean transition for companies, and also mitigate market fragmentation. What we are hearing from our clients, there's a continuing source of ambiguity, as the taxonomy has some conflicting timelines, and financial market participants offering Article 8 or 9 products with the environmental characteristics are required to report on taxonomy alignment from 1st of January 2022. And some of them are basically required to report from 2023 onwards. And also the taxonomy at the moment is not complete. Only the criteria for 2 of the 6 environmental objectives have been published, with the remainder to follow this year and next year. I mean, for example, in December last year, basically the article delegated gave us what published, which basically requires to make a certain disclosures and obligations, and the focus is really on taxonomy eligibility in the first phase rather than alignment. Based on the in-scope entity, this eligibility is required to be reported basically starting from this year and next year, and a phase 2, which basically focuses on alignment and basically is reporting on a KPIs. It's to evidence taxonomy alignment, again, depends on the scope and entity. It basically has been pushed to 23 and 24. I mean, 2023 and 24. But going back to your question about challenges, Jervis, I mean, applying the taxonomy in practice also leads to some, definitely some challenges. As the application is just starting there are clearly gaps between existing company internal requirements and requirements given through the taxonomy. Investment firms, particularly investment managers and product manufacturers, now need to work out what data they need, how they will analyze them, and also how they will report them. They also need to consider how the new requirements will affect their marketing, as well as their broader and product or portfolio specific investment strategies. And global mutual understanding of sustainable products and practices will take time, and an implementation of taxonomy thresholds is a key requirement. The current established practices require less sustainability related reporting, and thus a general lack of data causes difficulties in the assessment of technical criteria. Potential issues can occur through differences in the current stage of investments, also lack of incentives to information reporting, or lack of pollution thresholds set by government agencies. Overall, increased documentation, monitoring, and time is necessary to complete and monitor the use of proceeds. For example, small enterprises can experience certain limitations in disclosing taxonomy relevant information just due to lack of resources, experience, and incentives on providing the data. They are also often restricted in the access to adequate information that leads to making imprecise assumptions about sustainability measures of clients' businesses and the assessment of screening criteria. I think the systems need to be adapted and able to inspect the clients, their value chains. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, it's like because
Is your screen frozen?
I just froze. I don't know. Maybe you can see me, but I just froze.
Yeah, we can hear you. Well, I can anyway.
We can hear you.
Okay.
I mean, maybe if you could talk a little bit about the practical steps to consider when dealing with these hurdles, you know, for the benefit of the audience. What sort of things should we be really thinking about in terms of complying with this?
Okay. 1 sec. Okay, so in terms of practical steps, I mean, definitely specifying use of proceeds. And this may require the bank or investment portfolio manager to gain a comprehensive understanding of the client's value chain instead of only the end product. And if the purpose cannot be specified, the bank or the portfolio manager needs to classify the exposure based on the client's business activities, or limit the application to products with a specified use of proceeds. Also, examining the taxonomy eligibility of the business activity by identifying the environmental objective contributed to doing tests and assessing the compliance with the minimum social safeguards. The banks or investment managers might need to actually capture additional data or require more data from its customers or targets. Also disclosure of information for technical screening criteria by the client in a format easily accessible to check whether these criteria are met. During this transition period, assuming that the client complies with the relevant legislation, there's a huge reliance on certification schemes, third-party assurance and labels, whilst assuring that the potential gaps are filed through the bank or portfolio managers while actually they're trying to close the transaction. And not last but least is engaging with the sustainability experts and upskilling teams on sustainability.
Yeah, I think you know, the one that we've been wrestling with, and you know this better than me, is the famous or infamous SFDR that you mentioned earlier on. A lot of the blue boxes are to do with the SFDR. What exactly is the SFDR? I think we've got a slide on it here to help people navigate this, because you mentioned these articles. It's Article 8 and 9 and so on. I always get a bit confused about all of this.
Yes, the famous SFDR, as you mentioned. I mean, well, the SFDR became applicable 10th of March last year, and its scope captures financial market participants, which AIFM as a third party, basically also AIFM is a part of, and also financial advisors operating in the EU. And the SFDR sets specific rules for how and what sustainability related information they need to disclose. I mean, despite the complexity, the SFDR has a really simple objective, and it's avoiding basically greenwashing of financial products and financial advice in the EU by providing more sustainability related information. SFDR aims to ensure that EU investors have the disclosures they need to make investment choices in line with their sustainability goals. I mean, to achieve its objectives, the SFDR introduces the concept of principal adverse impacts, so-called PAIs, and these PAIs are essential to understanding the regulation as they represent the basic SFDR unit. And also there are the negative effects on sustainability factors that investment decision or advice might have. Sustainability factors are listed as environmental, social, employee matters, as well as matters relating to human rights, anti-corruption, and anti-bribery. But just going back to the slide and the diagram we have there, the SFDR differentiates really between two categories of products with sustainability features. Based on the articles in the SFDR, they're usually called Article 8 and Article 9. Article 8 products basically actively promote environmental social characteristics, and they're also called or nicknamed by light green products. And Article 9 products have a sustainable investment as their objective, and they're also called dark green products. I mean, at first glance, the SFDR creates a significant additional administration burden to fulfill on the disclosure requirements. However, it has a deeper, more far-reaching normative impact for providers of financial products and financial advice. Through disclosure requirements, SFDR essentially requires firms to make strategic decisions about their approach to sustainability. For example, to communicate how a product impacts sustainability, providers will need to decide whether to measure that impact. Does the provider have a system in place to measure these impacts? If it does, how does it work? If it doesn't, should it develop a system? I mean, which products are intended to minimize these principal adverse impacts and which are not? Where these principal adverse impacts are not considered, the SFDR requires a clear explanation for why this is not the case. I mean, in a summary, the impact of the SFDR will be significant in terms of additional disclosures. This includes developing and communicating new processes and procedures for entities affected by these requirements. It would also likely catalyze strategic choices on how to approach sustainability as a firm. And finally, the SFDR, I think, will unleash the flood of new sustainability information for investors to interpret. and an often expressed concern is the availability of relevant corporate data that feeds into those disclosures by financial market participants. I mean, look, in many ways, the impact of the SFDR is just really beginning.
What does it actually require people to do? What, you know, that I can get the shift, you know, non-ESG, then sort of slightly ESG, light green. I love this light green, dark green. But what are we required to do in order to, once we decide which one we do, how do we prove that we're compliant with this?
That's a really good question. I mean, the documentation firms are required to produce under SFDR are, thank you, that's the slide I was looking for. We're going to talk about.
Teed you up nicely, yeah.
Good timing. So yeah, so they are basically grouped into entity level and product level disclosures. The entity level disclosures apply for all financial market participants that fall within the scope of the SFDR, and then they came into force last March. All products marketed after the date should have already supplemented their pre-contractual documentation. And I'm referring to prospectus, private placement memorandums, LPAs, and offering memorandums with information relating to how sustainability risks are integrated in the investment decisions, including an assessment of the likely impacts of those risks on the returns of the products. And then products that promote environmental or social characteristics, as we mentioned on the previous slide, those Article 8 and 9, are required to disclose additional information in their pre-contractual documentation. That's the first step. That's basically kicked in last year. And then when I was talking about RTS level 2, this is basically the periodic reporting, which is reflecting annual reports, and also on their websites. And this is to explain why it has been labeled as such and how its objectives are measured. I mean, the main SFDR requirements at the level requires firms to undertake a series of disclosures. For example, the first one, information how an entity integrates sustainability risks in its investment decision-making process or financial advice, a statement on policies about how an entity considers these principal adverse impacts on sustainability factors, then information how remuneration policies are consistent with the integration of sustainability risks. And then the last one is pre-contractual disclosures on sustainability risk integration, including assessments of how the performance of financial products may be affected by those risks. At the product level, which is the fund on its own, so as AIFM, we manage basically alternative investment funds. At the product level, the SFDR requires firms to undertake a further series of disclosures depending on the objective of the given product. For firms that do consider these principal adverse impacts, an explanation on how financial products account for these impacts should be provided. This applies to all the firms' products, whether they are intended to meet sustainability goals or not. For Article 8 products that promote environmental social characteristics, there must be additional information on how these are met, including disclosures on the degree of taxonomy alignment of underlying economic activities. For Article 9, so-called these dark green funds, the products that have sustainable investments as objective, there must be an explanation how these objectives, how this objective is met or achieved, as well as additional disclosures on alignment with the EU taxonomy regulation.
Right. So I think it's probably time, I'm looking at the clock a little bit, probably time to open up for questions. We've got a couple of takeaways, I guess, just to sort of summarize the official formal part of the process. You know, there's massive opportunities in the ESG space in Europe. There's no question commercially, you know, there's a lot of scope if you can thread your way through this minefield of the regulations and come up with a robust ESG product, you can sell it. There's a lot of demand from the pension funds. Luxembourg clearly is emerging as the preferred jurisdiction, at least in Europe, European distribution for ESG. Lots of reasons for that, as Tomas laid out. Unfortunately, there's a bit of homework. You have to get up to date with the regulatory requirements. You have to have a team. You have to have an implementation strategy. But, you know, time didn't permit us to go into every nook and cranny. Tomas tried his best to keep it simple. I know it comes across as incredibly complicated. It is, but this is just scratching the surface. So if you have any questions, ask them now. But if you want to go away and think about it, the slides are going to be available. Please get in touch with us. You know, VISTRA's here to help on either side of the Atlantic. So we've got our colleagues in the US, be more than happy to answer in US time zone when Tomas and I are having one of these wonderful meals in the restaurants here in Luxembourg. But have we got time for some questions now, Tony? Or
yes, we do. And we have Jane Barton, which she can really ask you the question herself. Janet, can you, I think she can unmute herself. Hi, Jane, can you ask the question?
Hi, I just wondered if this was then going to add additional pressure on suppliers, on the supply chain. Is it going to be a case of sort of passing the buck, that then the fund industry is going to apply pressure to everyone along the supply chain to produce evidence of how green they are?
Yes, I mean, if I can take this one. For example, we have a meeting with the client, and they're classified as a residential fund or real estate residential fund, and they are classified as Article 9. So it's a really green, the best sustainable fund if you can imagine, but they actually need to prove what they are delivering, what they sign up for. So the meeting tomorrow we have is to really go through these RTS templates and understand how they actually going to populate these templates, which means really going to nitty-gritty, how we actually gonna, I mean, for example, the gas meters, electricity meters, how much energy you save, and also what contractors, for example, you're gonna hire to actually do the works. So it really is passing down the chain to not necessarily you and I per se, but small enterprises as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, of course, in the US as well, that the sustainable accounting standards and so on, all of the alphabet soup that we talked about at the start. But that's all private initiatives. The difference is, you know, the regulators coming in with their big boots and number 10s and trampling over the industry. Now, like all regulations, they're incredibly well intended. The question mark, I think, at this early stage is whether there's going to be a lot of extra cost involved in complying with the regulations. You know, we've already seen with AIFMD, you've got a belt and suspenders, or belt and braces, as we say in England, approach with a fund management company on top, like Tomas is the conducting officer for our one, supervising things, and then a depository to make sure the assets are safe. In the US, that wouldn't be the case. You would only need one type of supervision. You wouldn't need two levels of control. So the Europeans have tended to show a little bit more regulation towards everything, and ESG is no exception. So I think we'll see how this balances out. There'll still be a market for unsustainable product, if you like. If it's got very good performance, people will still go after that. But there's definitely a long-lasting impact of ESG. It's happened very, very quickly, as I said at the start, but it is definitely here to stay. And if you think about not so much your children, Jane, but my children's generation, you know, the youth of today, when I'm interviewing people at VISTRA for jobs, they'll come in and ask me what our waste disposal policy is. You know, it's almost like I'm being interviewed for the job. You know, they want to know what I'm doing about saving the planet. So there's a total change of culture coming about. And when you think about this wall of money that's going to transfer from the baby boomer generation to the next generation over the next 20 years, these people are serious investors in 20 years' time. They're going to have all the money. So that we commercially, Larry Fink and others know that they've got to have products that fit this type of hallmark, because they aren't. So we're at a really important tipping point at the moment.
That is great. Any other questions? Maybe Mr. Steinmetz, do you have any comments on what you heard, which would be interesting to hear? And if not, then we're going to go to Chairman from AmCham. Paul will do the closing, and probably, I think he also has a question, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, no news? No news is good news, okay?
Fine. And it's been very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, we thank you.
Tony, I had a question. Do we have time for me to ask it, or should I
Yes,
just?
yes, you do, you definitely do. We have 5 minutes.
My compliments, excellent presentation. But I have to say, when I and some of my colleagues have looked at the range of green investments up till now, unfortunately, the conclusion we've come to is that by and large, they're not very good investments. They're not very profitable unless there are substantial government funding and governmental subsidies. But on their own standalone merit, they're just not very good investments. So I guess part of my, I understand all the political pressure we all will be under, but if you don't mind my asking, I'd kind of appreciate your feedback on whether or not your assessment is that for the moment we have good investments that are worth doing aside from the social engineering standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go first, and Thomas can be much more analytical about it because he comes from the industry. It sort of drives me mad that people talk about ESG all in one phrase, because something that's, as you say, green is a very different motive from something that's socially responsible. And governance, frankly, has been around for donkey's years. If you think back to CalPERS and Hermes, the Post Office Pension Fund in the UK, back in the 80s, they were insisting that there was proper governance of the companies that they invested in. Then you had the green motives and COP26 and so on. I still think there's a massive amount that can be done on the social side, making sure that these are organizations where it's a nice place to work. That doesn't get much attention, because I think if you're in a people business like I am, whether people are engaged in their work environment is actually how you get the best returns. Motivated members of staff do better than unmotivated people. So it depends. So I agree with you about green. Green, you're probably paying a price for something to be green, as just the cost of the regulation is going to be some detraction from the investment return. But some of the other things, governance and socially responsible, clearly there's lots of academic evidence that proves that those organizations give better returns. So I think it depends whether you're looking at E, S, or G rather than ESG. But Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong. That's my layman's view of the situation.
Well, being a little bit analytical about it, I mean, even when I was a couple of years ago on the other side, when we were trying to actually look at how much it would cost us to be as green as possible, even was not as trendy as it is ESG and all these are SFDRs and taxonomy. I mean, for example, to bring the flat or investment residential building per flat in Germany can roughly cost you 10 grand, 15 grand. In Netherlands, it's pretty much double. So you really need to actually wait if it's worth it if it's really worth it doing it. And from the experience, because we had to do these disclosures last year with all the clients, and a lot of clients just opt out to be non-ESG, i.e. Article 6, and just waiting actually for all these regulations to kind of settle down. And they will basically pick what they actually want to do. And in the meantime, they're actually analyzing how much it would cost them to sign up for either Article 8 or 9.
Okay.
I mean, Amel, who's our marketing director at VISTRA, she came to us from ING, or NNIP as they were called latterly, and their whole sustainable team was poached by a US manager. So whether that's because they were able to squeeze more investment return, or whether it was because there was so much commercial appetite for ESG compliant funds, it doesn't really matter. They were much in demand, and experts in this space are going at higher and higher prices. So it's definitely a move towards this from a commercial point of view, as well as the do-gooding or the value to society. There's definitely a commercial angle on this as well, Paul. I know you're always very commercial, so very, very sensible.
Well, this has been an excellent presentation tonight, and regardless of some of the economic aspects of it, you all have done an excellent job of presenting to the audience that this is a fast-moving train, and it's going down the track, and it's in our best interest to be aware where the train is going and to make sure that we're on board, because it certainly is going to be important for the future. I have to anecdotally point out that, this is probably a perfect example of a new kind of digital green event that's environmentally friendly. We're doing this all digitally. We're not using a lot of petrol to go ahead and get to the place where the meeting takes place. And we're doing this on a transatlantic scale. My goodness, I think that not only did we have a great presentation tonight, but we did it in a way which is perfectly fits some of the objectives for sustainability as well. So I thank the entire VISTA team for going ahead and making this happen. Mr. Steinmetz, I'm very happy that you've been able to go ahead and join us for this. One of the interesting things that we have done over the past couple of years is tighten the relationship between AmCham and Luxembourg, using LICC and using AmCham to go ahead and do that. And I know for Tony and Janet and for me and my team, we're very proud that we've been able to go ahead and make a contribution in that regard too. So collectively, we're putting on great events on good subjects which are of interest. And for those of you who are in the audience, thank you so much for coming and joining us tonight. Please stay in touch with us and please join us, because we'll be doing more of all of this for the future. So I wish you all a good evening. And again, my sincere thanks to Jervis and his team for this excellent presentation tonight. And of course, to Tony and to Janet for putting it on. Thank you all very much and good evening.
Thank you,
Paul.
everyone.
Thank you,
Have
Paul.
a
Thank
great
you,
evening.
everyone.
Have a good day. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.